I'm Shari Jensen with Confident Kids Academy, and I am so excited to introduce Bjorn from Saskatchewan, Canada. And not only is she a veteran homeschooling parent of four kiddos, but she also grew up being homeschooled herself. So she is going to share her journey, her homeschooling journey with us, and as a child being homeschooled, and then also how that impacted how she homeschools now. So we're so happy to have you, Alissa. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really excited and so honored that you guys would ask me to share a little bit of my story and the things that I've learned. I found that I've talked to so many homeschool parents in just the last year who are just feeling a burden when it comes to their homeschooling and feeling like they are never enough and they can't do enough. So if anyone listens to this and just feels a bit more freedom and a little encouragement that they can do this and do this well, then that just gets me super excited.
Tell us about kind of the difference between your homeschooling journey as a child and how it looked different both socially. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of changes, maybe stigma wise or things like that, kind of address kind of the differences between homeschooling when you were a child and homeschooling today and what that looks
Yeah.
like.
I think in many ways, one of the differences was pressure. When my parents started homeschooling me and years ago, because I homeschooled like grade 1 through 12, all the things. It was also new that yes, people thought you were strange and a bit of an oddity because you were homeschooling, but they didn't have necessarily pressure on you. I think everybody presumed that your parents knew what they were doing. And if that's what they were doing, at least the experience that I had, there was definitely still the question around socialization and all that stuff. And you know, will your kids turn out okay? Because that's just an ongoing, always question. But I think there wasn't as much pressure to do all the things that I see in parents now. A lot of the homeschooling families, like I said, I've been talking to, they feel like they have to have all the right curriculum. There's no room for experimentation and shifting things. It's like, no, no, I have this curriculum I've committed to, and I'm going to do every single question in it. And then there's a lot of pressure on parents now to do all the extracurriculars and try and give their children a school-like experience, but from home. As where when I grew up, we did school Monday to Thursdays, only 4 days a week for about 2 hours in the morning. And that often included some piano. We'd have our chores done beforehand, and then we'd just sit down and we'd do 2 hours of bookwork and get it done, and then go off and play or go off and do the other things. At least it felt like go off to play. Now I look back and I see how my parents really set up things like, quiet time in the afternoon. So we were reading books every hour for the afternoon. Often over lunch, we would watch travel documentaries or things that stirred our interest. Back in the day when you'd go to the library and get the like 20-minute travel video that got you so excited because you didn't have access to all that on YouTube and whatever. Fridays when I was younger, we were often, going skiing or snowboarding or just having a day to do whatever. And then as I grew up, I had a paper route on Fridays. Then I worked in a restaurant during high school on Fridays, and I would not at that time have considered that as school. But now I look back and see how my parents actually put those things or made space for those things so that I was preparing for life even amongst my school years instead of having a pressure of, okay, we're doing 4 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon and we have to learn all these things and do all these questions. There was just a lot more freedom, I think, to explore the things that we love to learn. One of the big things that I loved about when I was doing school was I was really bad at science and math. It just wasn't my thing. It wasn't something I had no desire to be a nurse or go into those fields. And so my parents came to the conclusion quickly that this is going to be pulling like tooth and nail and you're going to be miserable, or we can pivot. And that's one thing I love about homeschooling is it's the freedom to pivot. So you won't talk to a lot of people who are successful in life that haven't got their diploma, mostly because everybody has been forced to get a diploma, whether they needed it or whether they didn't. And so I ended up just doing like what we called a portfolio, where I kept some of the work that I had done over my high school years, and I had no problem getting into secondary education, right? To going on to, Bible school and some of the things that I had wanted. There was never an issue with that. So again, it comes back to less pressure. I think homeschool parents now just feel that pressure to set their kids up for so much success and know all the things. And they feel like they have to um, lay this foundation that's so strong without realizing that in laying that foundation, there can sometimes be um, a lack of freedom and growth that then propels your kids into knowing what they want to do and enabling them to do that.
It it definitely is a different time for sure.
Mhm.
So that kind of brings us to like, what does your typical day, now that you've shared with us about like what a day looked like when you were a kid, what does your typical day look like homeschooling your kids? Tell us a little bit about your kiddos first of all,
Sure.
first, and then tell us what a typical day kind of looks like in your home.
Yeah, for sure. So I have four kids, 5, 7, 9, and 11. We just switched over to the odd numbers. And so we're the wide range, right? Kindergarten starting to read, all the way up to like school's getting pretty serious. We're in the grade 5, 6 era. But what I have done, and looking back at where my parents had done, and then this past year we lived in an RV and we just had this crazy year of transition, and so much clarity has come to me on what is important when it comes to our personal homeschool. Um, I don't know how many of you guys have ever taken a look at homeschooling and stripped everything away and said, okay, what is the foundation? What have I been told are expectations on homeschool, and what is actually necessary? What is normalized for a massive group of children, but what needs to be normal for my child? And then giving yourself the freedom to really strip that away and build your school upon a new foundation of what your family's priorities are. And so I wrote down a few priorities for us, and it's really based off the things that we value as a family, not outward expectations. And that can be scary because I know a lot of, you know, parents come into homeschool, like we had just talked about, with all this weight of expectations of needing to match what the school's done, needing to have their children be at the same level of all the things or what they think are all the things that other school kids are at. But to take it down and say, okay, what is the foundation? And know that there are different ways to school. um, I don't know if you guys have ever looked into schooling around the world. It's a fascinating thing. And one of the things I love is when I learned that in Denmark, they don't even start math till grade 6. Like there's
Really?
no math. Yeah, there's no math till grade 6. And they jump from basic math to algebra within 2 years because the kids are ready to learn. They've been primed in their thinking to learn. The first 2, 3 years of Danish schooling prioritizes outside play, and outside play in ways that develop fine motor skills as well as major motor skills, right? So things like actually carving wood with knives in kindergarten. And that's something that our culture, like I remember having friends over and their 4-year-old that wasn't allowed to use scissors yet because their parents were so scared that something would happen. So prioritizing that freedom. And so when I started learning about, oh, school is done in different ways around the world, and Denmark is one of the top rated educational systems in the world. I was actually doing a little research before call today. And on their website, the Denmark website is, we do not prioritize memorization and answering questions, but learning to ask questions and grow to love learning. And their whole culture then has become based on a love of learning and a desire to learn versus a set bunch of workbooks or facts that they need to have known. And so I think when I learned that a few years ago, it really started to inform my understanding of what school would look like to our family and the priorities. And then, like me and Shari were just talking about, we spent about 6 months living in an RV. There was a whole COVID season where, my husband was working from home and I was working from home. And we had to learn to really pivot in our schooling in a way that instead of necessarily doing school, we were really educating our children. I think there's a difference in just doing school and educating. Um, So yeah, I wrote down a list of our priorities, and that'll kind of fill you in what our days look like. Okay, so first priority for me and my husband has always been reading, right? If the world is open to you, I mean, you guys have a heart for reading of anybody, right? You get this. Um, Prioritizing a heart for reading, a love of good stories, a desire and a craving to get more and more of that. And some of the ways, like we have chosen not to be overly grade bound. Like my kids would say they have a grade, but we've never gone to, oh, this book is your grade level. This book is your grade level. But rather trying to expose them to a very wide variety of books. My oldest, who's 11 now, she actually learned to read through a history book, right? She just has this love and desire of the facts and the pictures that went along, trying to figure it out. And, she'd come to me, and I remember, she was still pretty young. And she came to me, she's like, Mom, why do the people in the Vikings actually like kill the wife if her husbands die and send them off in a boat? Because she had wanted to learn this, that she had taught herself reading in many ways through finding a book that she was interested in. Um, Moving on, right? Like having things like she does audiobooks. We do a lot of audiobooks in our house because it expands your vocabulary, and then it makes you want to read that book to see if it's actually saying what you've heard. And so my kids listen to Jane Austen, Louise May Alcott, and a lot of these, what would be considered higher level books for the age that they're at, and yet it actually rises their own capability of reading. Wing Feather Saga is one my son is loving right now. And so for us, reading and prioritizing time for reading, like making sure there is a chunk of time for the kids to read. And when they're younger, yeah, it's picture books. Yes, it's a sibling reading to them, mom reading to them, but even reading out loud, I think our kids need to see that we have a passion for reading and that we are reading and that there's a stack of books by our bed, and then talking to them about what we're reading. Um, the biggest way, I think, overall schooling, I guess we can talk about priorities, but if I, as a parent, aren't doing the things that I want them to do, the reading, the being healthy, the getting outside, then the words really become empty. So as a family, we've read Lord of the Rings in the last couple of years, and the kids would sit and do their art or do Lego or whittle in front of a fire, right? As we are reading it, just making books a natural part of our schooling, but also life, because schooling is so much more life.
Yeah,
Um,
and your Lord
Boredom.
of the
Mhm.
Rings, I mean, that's hard reading. I mean,
Yeah,
that's got a lot of vocabulary, and it's English, like British English, and it's very difficult reading. So that's a great idea to read it out loud while they're doing something else that they like to do too, so that their ears are absorbing, they're listening to it, it's going in
exactly.
to their mind, but their hands are busy so that they don't get bored, and so that their minds are open.
Yeah,
Awesome.
totally. And I mean, character development and life lessons that you can talk about coming out of a book like that. And I always love to expose my kids to the next level of education. I think that's one of the priorities is, okay, this is the level that you're at, but we're going to show you what's coming next. Yeah, you don't understand everything in Lord of the Rings, but you can grasp a little bit. And in grasping that little bit, you're going to learn a little bit, and you're going to hunger for that next level where, suddenly you have a 12-year-old who's picking up The Hobbit and just wants to read it, right?
Okay,
Um,
so your first priority is reading, and then so what do you choose next then for your priority?
Priorities. It sounds really strange, but boredom. We prioritize boredom because our kids need to have a space to process all the things that's going on, let their minds just clear. And I think there really is very little things that are as healthy for our kids' brains as getting bored. Because what happens is when you let your kids get bored, and you don't just say, oh, you don't know what to do. Well, sure, there's chores. Or, here's a toy, here's a game, here's a video. They're constantly having input given to them versus processing and the outwork. And I've seen over and over again, if they get to the place, I call it the wall of boredom, if they can break through that, if you send them outside and there's no toys and they have nothing to do, or they just don't want to play with the toys, it never fails that something creative happens. Their brain processes the past, processes whatever it needs to, and then it finds its creativity. And so for me, I guess boredom would be tied with creativity. If the kids are going out together and they don't know what to do, within 5, 10, maybe even 15 minutes, suddenly there's something kind of adventure that they're playing, or they've created a story, or they're building something. So boredom is actually a huge one. And that's hard for me as a parent because I will always see the things that they're supposed to be doing. I will always see the chores they didn't get done, or the laundry that didn't get put away, or the toys they don't play with, or the schooling they could be doing, or the book they should be reading. But to actually give them space to get bored and then allow them to move through into creativity is really huge for us.
That's really powerful. I mean, I think about my own kids. I mean, they were bored more because of as as kind of a punishment because they were not cleaning up their rooms, and I was like,
Mhm.
okay, look, if your room is not, if you don't have at least this section finished in 15 minutes, then you don't get to play with any of your toys tomorrow. And
Yep.
they would end up getting their toys taken away, and it always amazed me how my sons could have two pen caps, just the caps of pens, and make a whole entire adventure out of it. It didn't bother them a bit that they didn't have anything to play with.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And that is one of the things that's actually kind of got me on a minimalism journey, because I think things, if they create stress in my own life and in my own mind, like everyone knows the stress of going into a messy, overwhelming kitchen versus something that's clean and ready to go. If that's happening in my own world, what about my kids who are constantly having to clean up the room because they're not cleaning up the toys that they took out, played for 30 seconds, and then moved on? Versus having the creative things like pen caps or blocks, or going outside and just making a pile of leaves, or whatever. Like, there's so much joy for our kids to be found in the simplicity of not having too much. But that's not even on my priority list, but it kind of comes into that boredom thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. All
Mhm.
right, I'm so excited. Tell us what's next then.
It's actually kind of funny. Hard work and chores. That's my next one. So now that you're talking about chores, um, we have always prioritized, if a child is capable of doing a job, they should. Does that mean I never do dishes? No, because there are a point where you just need to get it done. But always, like, expecting our children to take care of their rooms and take care of the mess, even if there are days that will take an hour every single day. Helping out in house chores. So right now, what we're doing is we just recently moved into 11 acres that has tons of grown, beautiful trees full of dead wood. And so it has been daily raking and hauling wood, raking and hauling wood. And I think one of the beautiful things, and why I would consider this school, is because and I'll touch on this again later, but we want to raise adults, future adults, not children. You are not raising children. You are raising future adults who are going to be parents, who are going to need to hold down a job, which means doing the hard thing. Future adults who are going to be married someday. And I want to raise kids that I would want my kids to marry, right? And so for us, okay, there are definite chores. If you love to bake, I am going to encourage you to bake, but you're going to learn how to clean up after yourself, because that's real life. If you want to have stuff in your room, then you're going to learn to clean up your room. And guess what? If you haven't, I am going to point out the bug that is living underneath your sock, right? Like, I'm going to show them the effect of that, or when they can't find the thing that they want. I'm always looking for those learning opportunities. But part of our school day, a big part of it is doing chores. And that'll be cleaning bathrooms for the older ones. That'll be folding and putting away laundry, sorting through the laundry. Our dishwasher broke, so our kids are doing dishes a lot right now. And it drives them crazy. But what I've seen in the last 2 months of not having a dishwasher is they're actually getting clean dishes now. They're actually learning to focus and get it done. They're actually learning to work together as a team. And so those are the things that we so easily cast off and say, oh, I'll do the dishes because you got to go do your math homework. But in reality, especially if you have two or more children together and they're clashing, these are the opportunities for them to learn how to problem solve and resolve issues and work through hard things. And so much of our growth as human beings comes out of learning to do the same thing monotonously over and over and over. Like for anyone who's ever tried to get in shape, you don't get in shape the first day you go to the gym. Maybe not even the first 6 weeks, but it's doing the thing you don't want to do monotonously over and over with consistency. And so
Mhm.
for me, chores is a way of teaching that lesson of doing the not fun things because it sets your future self up for success. So even while right now it drives them crazy that every afternoon they're out, scraping away the leaves, they're going to enjoy the yard that brings for all that hard work. And so, yeah, hard work and chores,
Yeah.
I consider applied learning essentially.
Yeah. And it's so crazy because the things that, you look back in your own life, the things that you just couldn't stand doing, now you enjoy them. They're like your therapy.
I know. Well, even doing the yard work,
Awesome.
I'm like, I just want to go out and do more yard work. I'm hauling sticks and lighting up. We have a fire going and I'm loving it. What I was going to mention with this, like, with again, the chores, it's also another place for them to be creative because some of these chores are monotonous. They might be bored. And so they want to figure out a way to do it faster. And so just yesterday, like we've been hauling leaves and stuff for a couple of days now. My 9-year-old actually, she got out this little red wagon that we have and she roped on a bunch of Rubbermaid bins, which I had been counting as one load. So if you have a goal of 30 loads, well, now suddenly you got 3 Rubbermaids on one wagon. And if you're working as a team to fill them up and only one has to take it back and forth, you're cutting down on your effort and your time. And so again, then, if they had um, a 30 load goal, well, my kids started going, okay, there's 4 of us. That's about like 6 each. And like they're figuring out the math without me having to sit down and write them on their paperwork. They know the basics and now they're applying it in really cool ways.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was so that reminds me of last week. We had to haul a bunch of wood. We had to cut down a tree or half of a tree because it was starting to come out of the roots and starting to fall. And being able to um we had so much wood that we needed to haul out to the road, and there was no way we could carry it all. It would have taken so many hours. So my son decided to get like straps and wrap it around, and we used the car because neither of us could like pull it or anything. So hooked it up to the back of the car, pulled it, got halfway up, and we're like, okay, this isn't working because this side's coming off. Now we need to rethink. And it probably took altogether the time that it took. Probably we may have been able to do it ourselves, in that amount of time. But it was so much more fun to like problem solve and come up with a solution instead of just doing it the same old way. So that's so important.
And that's life lessons and memories. And those two things are invaluable. Invaluable, right? He's creating
Mhm.
memories with you. I'm guessing you laughed together. I'm guessing you thought this is so silly, but we got to figure it out, right? And then also just this knowledge of, hey, there was a problem, I surmounted it. There was a problem, I surmounted it. And, our world talks a lot about having self esteem, but if it's not rooted in anything, it's worthless. But if you can create an identity that's rooted on something, one of the things I do with my kids a lot is just self-talk, right? So when my 5-year-old just doesn't want to put on her socks, I get her to yell at me, I am capable. And it's amazing. You get a 5-year-old to say, I am capable. Suddenly they're laughing. Suddenly the sock's on in seconds. And they have this moment of like, oh, I guess I can put on my sock. And like she can totally put on a sock. It was a hissy fit. But in all the things that they find challenging, right? You're creating so many life lessons that are coming out of that. Okay, so that actually does lead into my next one, which is personal and spiritual growth. This is a huge, what I would consider a missing piece in typical schooling, yet reaps benefits for years, like for the whole life. And why wouldn't we start with personal growth with our children? And I mean, the trick is it has to start with you. Like I've been on a personal growth journey that then I share with my children, like little things like what you're saying in your head. If you're saying I can't, well, you're going to sit on your butt and get nowhere. But if you say, I don't think I can, but I'm willing to learn, or I am capable, that changes where you're going to go. So we always prioritize both spiritual growth. Our faith is really important to us. So my kids have Bible time every morning. That's part of their reading and their growing and discussing, and but also personal growth. So my 11-year-old, when she was about 9, I actually had her read How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's a classic when it comes to personal growth, and she loved it. She carried that book around on car rides. I think she had read 5 times in the first 2 years, or the first, 2 months. Because I think there were so many things when it comes to personal growth that make sense to us, but somebody needs to put them on paper. Why is it important to remember people's names? Like, we don't teach children to focus on learning their friends' names. It's just another buddy. But they know the value of being called by name and being seen and known. So a couple like really good authors or resources that I love. One is How to Win Friends and Influence People, because I mean, not everyone would be able to do it in grade 5, but there's just stories. It's mostly a book about stories. And so doing that with your kids, like that's one that you could do with your kids. John Acuff, he has a book called Soundtracks, and he actually just released one for teens called Your New Playlist, I think is what it is. And again, it's talking about, okay, well, what's going on in your mind? And I know I see my kids, like, now that I'm aware of it, I can recognize when you are just allowing your thoughts to spiral when it comes to your writing or your reading or your school or whatever. What would happen if we taught them right away, like at a young age, to like capture those thoughts and say, okay, well, what's something you should be saying to yourself? John Maxwell is a really good one. It's a little bit more adult oriented, but there are some like 15 laws for personal growth that you could do a chapter a day with your children, and you can talk about it. And then you start looking through the day for examples like, hey, didn't we just read about that? Hey, didn't we just learn that? YouTube has a ton. I mean, you have to kind of pick through what's good or bad, but Jim Rohn is classic. Trent Shelton has some really good stuff on there. Henry Cloud talking about relationships. Like, what if with our children, we started teaching them how to have strong relationships, teaching them how to, like, hey, so-and-so said something that you didn't appreciate. How do we work around that and be emotionally aware of what's going on? And then strengthen, like, are you strong enough to say, hey, I'm sorry, right? Like the personal growth that comes when you're intentional about it is huge. All right, next one. I know there's lots. Well, there's a couple more. Outside time. Outside/active. I do live in Saskatchewan where we get like minus freezing cold, sometimes for weeks at a time. But for us, it's always been a priority of outside time. Part of it is it gets them into that free play space. And I think our culture really devalues the importance of free play with or without siblings or friends, to just go out and be children, in particular without parental supervision, which is really, really hard. Like, I have to keep myself back and let them figure it out. But that's how they figure things out that they are capable of. Physical, like just being physical outside, having strong, healthy bodies has an insane impact on how they're able to do the traditional schoolwork, how they're able to do their book work. For me, a healthy child should always be able to sit and focus and read, as well as play hard and go hard outside. And so often those things are tied together, right? You need to rest a child who's ready to go and play, not just frantic. But you need a child who's being physically active, who's going to be able to come back in and focus. So active time outside, wrestling, encouraging our kids to wrestle together, because it actually teaches them self-control, right? Like, I'm bigger than you. I'm going to regulate myself so that we can continue wrestling because I'm enjoying it. That's a hard thing to teach unless it's just practical experience, right? Same thing when kids are playing tag with a bunch of different ages. And one of the reasons I love homeschooling, especially if there's multiple kids, is they're learning different ages. You know, a 7-year-old has to learn how to tag his 11-year-old sister differently than he tags his 5-year-old sister, right? There's all these things that outside play just teaches them. Something I started a long time ago that's on the physical side is a tickle of the day. And for anyone who has a 3 to 5-year-old boy, this is your best friend. A tickle of the day can be 30 seconds to 1 minute where me as a mom just gets in his face and I tickle him. Well, I tickle all my children, but you can't stay a grumpy parent when your son is laughing or when your child is laughing. They can't stay grumpy if they're getting tickled. Laughter does things like chemically on the inside of us.
Yes.
And almost any challenge or grumpiness or frustration of the world will just melt away for both you and your child if you do a tickle of the day. So I think that is one of my key priorities and probably one of the easiest.
It's
Right.
my son always talks about getting his daily beatings, and people would misunderstand that, if they
Yeah.
didn't even know us. But when he was little, he was, he would be sad when his dad went out of town for the week because he wasn't getting his beatings,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Totally.
the
Totally.
wrestling and tickling and all of that. It is interesting though. My middle son never liked being tickled because he has sensory issues, and it was
Mm,
too much
yeah.
sensory input for him. So
Yeah.
he
But then you would have found some way to connect too,
exactly,
right? Yeah.
yes, yeah. With him, it was more the cuddle up time and
Yeah.
stuff.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. So priority outside time and even just physiological things that it does for their body, their balance, right? Hanging is huge for kids. It just helps them, their whole body process what's going on. Climbing is a natural thing. And so often we say, oh, don't climb on that, rock, or oh, don't climb on that tree, when they're so wired to do it. And it actually is helping them develop mentally. And when they're physically developing, they're also mentally developing, which then helps them with their education. Two more priorities. Health. Health is a really, really key one for my family, because there are so many things, like when it comes to your child being able to sit and read a book or process math or learn about the world around them. If their bodies aren't healthy, if they don't have the energy and the brain clarity, I've seen that over and over again, that can really hold them back. So things that our family prioritizes in their health beyond like just physical activity and outside is, I would say, we're sugar light. We're not sugar free, we're sugar light. And ways I've communicated this with my kids, like, you want their buy-in because all kids love sugar. But I need to give parents permission to say no. And so often we don't feel like we should say no. I'm like, oh, I love to treat my child. I love, but it gets to be so much. And the truth is, your kid will feel just as rewarded with a chocolate chip as they will with a cookie. And yet the sugar content is massively different. And I mean, some kids love stickers and balloons, and anytime you can do a non-sugar reward, great. But there are places for it. Um, but what I have always found, and I know so many parents I've talked to, is if their kid has too much sugar or even regular sugar intake, their brains change. Like I remember seeing my daughter, she had a slushie somebody had brought over. And suddenly she was jumping on the chairs and running around and talking. And she couldn't actually pay attention to us. Like she couldn't physically actually slow down or obey. Like her brain was so high on sugar. And I think our culture has created a culture around sugar where, right, you get your Halloween candy, and that's probably not all gone by Christmas. And then it's Christmas holiday season, and that's not gone by Valentine's Day. And then it's Easter, and then it's, well, summer barbecues and popsicles. And so we have this cycle of sugar that's really affecting our kids' bodies and health. It plays a huge role in their immune system. It plays a huge role in their mental health, right? And it plays a huge role in their gut microbiome, which I'll talk about next. So a couple things that I have done with my kids is talking about the best. So gut health plays a huge role, and that's actually something that I'm super passionate about and I work with, is gut health. And I think we're going to dig into this probably next week a little more. But when it comes to your gut health, sugar feeds the bad guys. And so I talk about it very simply with my kids. I'm like, okay, you could have this whole cupcake, but remember the bad guys. There's good guys and bad guys in your gut. Do you want the good guys to win or the bad guys? Because the bad guys, they love sugar, and they're actually telling your brain you want that sugar. But what if we went with an apple? What if when mommy and you went out for a date, instead of going to a coffee shop to get, a giant cookie or cupcake, how would you feel about grabbing strawberries and hitting the park, going for a walk? right? So those are little things. And the more clear you can be with your kids on what's going on in their body when they're eating sugar, it just simplifies then when you, and like, I don't say, no, don't eat that birthday cake, but my children will come to me with happy birthday cake and say, Mom, I'm just done. Mom, it's just too much for me. And so that is, again, that personal growth of taking responsibility for their health. The other thing that is huge mental health and academic health implications is actually red food coloring. And we don't talk about it enough. So if that's just one of those simple things, you can do a test, put celery in green and blue and red food coloring, and the red food coloring will kill celery. And yet we don't really think about that. So my friends laugh when my kids come over because they'll be given like Smarties or whatever, and my kids pick out the red ones and throw the garbage. And that's just their way of doing a healthy choice.
Wow. So you're saying that if you put red dye 40, like celery in it, it will kill the celery.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the other dyes don't.
No. I mean, no dye is really great,
Right.
but we'll pick red as the ultimate bad guy. I'll send you a picture of it later.
That's crazy. I know that when my son has had to go to a urologist and they put him on an elimination type diet, or they were trying to, forgot why. Also, I think for me, for bladder infections, but um one of the things that they said was no red dyes. They said he could have other colored dyes, but they said no red.
Yeah. Yep. They know. They know. They just Smarties does now do natural dye. So if you're gonna do a treat for your kids or decorating your birthday cake, like Smarties is a good option. They've gone to like using, beet coloring and that kind of stuff as an option. So that's, you can't take your whole world and change it, especially when it comes to health. But it's like, okay, what are the little things I can teach my children now? And yeah, gut health plays a huge role. So if you're able to like cut back on your sugar and then make sure your kids are getting good supplements to support their gut health, there's the vagus nerve actually connects your gut to your brain. And so anytime you see a kid who's just, often jittery or can't focus and, always tired. Like one of the first things I always say is, are they pooping regularly? Because if they're not pooping regularly, their body's just full of toxins, and that is so hard for them to focus. And how is their gut health? Like those are simple steps that you can take. If you're worrying about a diagnosis of ADHD or some of these things, like those are always some of the frameworks that I will suggest. It's just like, hey, well, let's start with some basics and see what happens. Okay, so last one basically is what we already touched on is long-term thinking. You are not raising a grade twoer. You are raising a future adult. You're not homeschooling a kindergartner. You are homeschooling somebody who is going to be a grade one, grade two, grade three, going to be an adult. And so asking questions like, are my kids going into somebody who I would want my kids to marry? What kind of things would be priority for me to look in another child or in like for a future adult? Like, are they kind, right? Am I teaching my kids kindness? Are they generous? Are they learning from a young age to hold their hands open in abundance instead of being scarce with all their stuff? Do I like to be with them? That's actually a really good question to ask yourself. And there are times and seasons in my homeschooling journey where I have had to say, hey, we're actually going to stop all your basic book work right now. And we're just going to go to the park and hang out and remind each other of how much we love each other. And, take a day of encouraging each other. Take a day of like, maybe we're just going to do an art project and listen to an audiobook. Again, homeschooling is just beautiful for that pivoting, right? Where you can see what they need and what they're going through. And, I have a preteen daughter right now. And so, wow, we're just getting a little bit more attitude. It's okay. What are the things I need to do to build the relationship where she feels like she can share what's going on and I can help her work through some of these things? One of the things I love is just asking them questions, right? If they're like, Mom, I can't do this. Well, why do you think you can't do this? What do you think would need to be done in order to help us solve this problem? Putting problems in front of them, saying, how do you think we should solve this? Right? You know what? I have 5 cookies and there's 10 kids coming over. what do you think we should do? Um,
Yeah.
and one of my big things when I'm talking about like long term is when you're looking at your curriculum, don't get tied to every question. I think sometimes as homeschool moms, we feel our identity is attached to a perfectly finished workbook. And then our kids go and doodle, and they might even scribble over some of the questions. And maybe they're just not listening to you, or they don't want to do one question. It becomes a battle, and there's a time for the battle. There's a time to just say, okay, you know what, we're going to move on. For me, if my kids can show reasonable understanding of a process, then I will get the review. Like there may be 6 subtraction questions in every review for every chapter for the rest of the book. But what if they are fine with just one? And some kids are going to need more, some are going to need less. But it's okay to say, hey, you know what? We're going to do math twice a week, but we're going to do it 2 chapters, and we're actually going to do half the chapters because we can work it through it faster. And again, it all depends on where your kid is. But going back to releasing expectations, every kid learns at a different rate. So I had a child who learned how to read at a grade 5 level in grade 1. And then I got to my second kid. I'm like, you're going to teach yourself to read too. And she didn't. And I had to let go of the expectations that the world was putting on me and that other people were putting on me. Say, okay, what does my daughter need right now? And sure enough, by grade 2, grade 3, she picked it up and we were good to go. But I could have spent months stressing on where she wasn't at versus, okay, where does she need me to lean in and teach her? Where maybe I need to do more reading and exposing her to good stories. And so even in math, like that's the one thing I think parents we get so stuck in what we are told of where they should be versus, okay, what do they need from me to help encourage them in this direction? How can I make this fun? How can I open up their understanding? And an honest understanding of, you know what's really hard this month might be really easy this month. So I could take 10 hours teaching them a concept that they're not really going to get this month, or we could revisit it when they're a month older and they've grown a little bit, and it might take 10 minutes.
So
So
true.
I think that is my basic priorities.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alissa, for sharing all of that with us. It's so wonderful to hear all of your feedback and your perspective as a veteran homeschooling mom. So your mom did such a great job of helping you guys realize your potential and your giftings. So tell us a little bit about each of your siblings and how you feel your parents helped to direct their paths so that they could be equipped to follow their dreams as adults.
Yeah, sure. So there were 4 of us. And I think one of the things that my parents just did really good was allowing us to explore some of our passions and some of the things that we were really excited about. So my brother, it was very clear very early on that he just loved music. He was the guy that would just sit at a drum set and start banging out rhythm. Like it was so natural for him. But instead of trying to fit him into a specific mold, my parents really helped equip him to do what he loved to do. So they made sure that he had good piano lessons for sure, but they also got him access to a good computer that had some of the resources he needed for music production. And so by the time he quit high school, he was already starting to produce music. He actually went to a college for a while and dropped out 2 years into the college program because he's like, they're teaching things 5 years ago. And the things I was teaching myself in high school are the current things. And so he went and opened up his own music studio, and it's been really, really well successful. And it was his heart passion that I can see my parents made space for him to grow into. But even more than that, learning to learn, right? By equipping him with, okay, they didn't know about music production. My mom played piano, but that was a limit of her musical experience. But they had cultivated a love of music. And then they'd given him those resources and just really teaching. I think the biggest thing they did for my family was teaching us to love learning. And looking back now, like, remember I had talked about personal growth. My dad always loved personal growth. And I just like, oh, dad's making us listen to one of these tapes again on our long drives. And I mean, secretly, I really liked it. But I think there was so much of that then taught us to love learning and to love growing because we saw our parents learning and growing. So for me, there were years I didn't know what I wanted to do, go overseas and do some charity work or go do this or go to that. And I think looking back now, I really appreciated my parents didn't try and put me into a mold. They didn't say, okay, well, you need to have, go get a job doing something or go for after a career. It was like, no, it's okay to waitress and travel and lean into what you wanted to do. And then I found a love for photography in my early 20s. And so I actually taught myself photography and got, I don't know, reasonably, people would pay me to do it. So reasonably successful. And I credit that now to my parents, enabling me to lean into things that I wanted to learn. So even like I talked about my high school, when they let me let go of going the diploma route, it was okay. I still need to do essays and learn things. What do I want to learn? So I was writing essays on the French Revolution and essays on snowboarding and essays on, an ancient Egyptian pharaoh that I thought was linked to Joseph, right? Like all these things. And so I learned research. I learned the hard things about learning, because learning always is fun when you start. It gets really bogged down in the middle, and then it's exhilarating when you finish. And so learning how to process through that. And so same thing with photography. You get this idea, you take one good picture. Well, then you have to learn how to okay, well, how can I start taking consistent pictures? What does editing look like? How do I market myself, right? And so learning those things. My younger brother, a similar story to my older brother. He was partially deaf, but he had just this love for computer animation. And so, back 15, 20 years ago, computers were a lot more clunky, but there was access to computer software that could help him, do his animation. But that wasn't enough. So then he learned the back end, like whatever's behind Windows, so he could do a different operating system, so he could learn more things. So he became a whiz at computer stuff because he had this love for computer animation. Well, he again went and did some school in New Zealand and was the only one in a 2-year class, he got put into the second year right away because he already in high school had learned enough to skyrocket him through. He was the only one out of his class hired. And he went on to work for the company that did VeggieTales, and then Sony in Vancouver doing penguins in Madagascar. And then he got headhunted by a company called Weta out of New Zealand, the guys who did Lord of the Rings. And so currently he pretty much picked his wage, and he works for Weta Digital this summer he'll be working on set with Avatar 3. But he had learned how to learn what was coming down the line, right? He wasn't just doing the current programs. He was hungry to learn what was the next program. How do I utilize it for my job? How do I keep going? And so he had learned to be a step ahead in that game, which is a highly competitive game. And it's just paid off for him. So that is really, really cool. And then I have a younger sister, and her first job was as a waitress. And within, I think, 6 months, the management had sought her out and said, hey, you're the kind of person we want to have working in our office. It was a Moxie's in Edmonton, and we'd like you to be our bookkeeper and kind of one of our liaisons to the restaurant. And she looked at them like, 19-year-old girl who just been a waitress. And she's like, I have no bookkeeping experience. And they're like, no, but you're homeschooled. So you know how to learn, and we're not going to have to teach you out of any bad habits. And so she went to do that for years. She became one of the top managerial people for Moxie's Canada. By the age of 23, she could walk into any Moxie's in Edmonton and basically tell them, straighten your tie, sweep that floor, and make me my lunch, right? So I look back now and I'm just so grateful that my parents set things in place. And like I said, we only did school 4 days a week, 2 hours a day, but they helped us, Fridays, a job, doing paper routes, doing the gardening, doing the hard things. And they set us up for this love for learning and this knowledge that we could learn. Like where we set our mind to, we could figure it out.
Right.
What is one piece of advice that you have for new homeschooling moms?
Oh my lands. One piece is really hard. I'll encapsulate a few in a little bit of an idea. I think enjoy the ride and let go of the stress of expectations, right? Enjoy being with your children and have eyes open for the opportunities that are just there. I was thinking, we just moved again to this acreage and we're going to set up a garden. And when I think about the garden and doing that, so many of the things that I talked about of my priorities, they fit into just simply gardening, right? You're talking about, okay, let's calculate Well, first of all, let's do some reading and learning about gardening and what makes a good garden. Let's talk about math and like, how are we going to line up our stuff? What needs to go together? Which plants work well together to get rid of the pests? Like, then let's do teamwork because we're going to be outside. It's going to be hot. It's going to be boring. Weeding is no fun. I detest weeding. And yet, how are we going to get past that because we have an end goal in mind? How are we going to work together as a team when, so and so might bump so and so or look at them wrong or snap because they're hot and tired or, they disappeared? How do we move on past ourselves and work together as a team? And then how do we rejoice in the harvest together? And so for me, homeschooling is a lot like gardening, right? Looking for those things that we can do together as a family that are growing, that encapsulate a lot of the values of our family, but are also showing our kids that it's worth putting the hard work consistently over time to get what you want. Because if my kids can leave my home knowing that they are capable of getting what they need, of learning what they're going to need, of going where they want to go, then for me, that is fully educated. That is, you are ready to go and step into the world. So that would be what I would say. Teach your kids to love learning, look for the opportunities, and enjoy the ride.
Thank you for sharing, Alissa, and we are looking forward to future um, uh, interviews with and where we can pick your brain some more. So thank you so much. Have an
Looking forward to it too.
yes.